Have you ever wondered why, even after all this time, one person still lives inside your mind like they never truly left? You try to move forward. You distract yourself. You stay busy. You tell yourself you are healing. But late at night, their memory quietly returns. One old conversation, one small reminder, one imagined moment, and suddenly your chest feels heavy again. Your mind starts reopening emotional doors you promised yourself you would never enter again. You replay the past. You imagine different endings. You wonder if they still think about you. You secretly hope for one more message, one more sign, one more moment. And the most painful part is, sometimes you already know they are no longer meant for your life. Yet, your mind still refuses to let them go. But Buddhism teaches something most people never truly understand. You are not suffering because you lost them. You are suffering because your mind became attached to the emotional world it created around them. Because, after a while, it is no longer the real person hurting you. It is the memory, the fantasy, the attachment, the version of them your mind keeps rebuilding every single day. And until you understand this, the past will continue living inside your head, quietly stealing your peace. But tonight, you are going to understand the real reason you cannot stop thinking about them, and how to finally free your mind from someone who no longer belongs inside your soul. The mind becomes obsessed with what it never fully understood. The mind struggles deeply with unfinished emotional experiences. It does not like uncertainty. It does not like confusion. It does not like endings that arrive without clear explanation. When someone leaves your life without giving your heart complete understanding, your mind continues chasing answers long after the relationship is over. This is why you replay conversations repeatedly in your head. You analyze small details. You overthink their behavior. You revisit old memories, trying to discover the exact moment everything changed. You remember one sentence they said months ago, one cold reply, one strange silence. One moment, their energy felt different, and your mind keeps asking, what happened? Why did they change? Did they ever truly care? Was I not enough? Could I have fixed this somehow? The mind becomes obsessed because it believes understanding the past will finally remove the pain. It keeps telling you, if I can just figure it out, maybe I will finally feel peaceful again. But often, the search itself becomes the suffering, because now you are no longer simply remembering the relationship. You are mentally living inside it every single day. You begin waking up with thoughts about them, sleeping with thoughts about them, carrying invisible emotional conversations inside your head all day long. And slowly, your mind turns into a courtroom. Every memory becomes evidence. Every silence becomes a hidden meaning. Every emotional wound becomes another mystery your mind tries to solve. You start connecting small details together. Why they became distant. Why they stopped trying. Why they changed their tone. Why they suddenly felt emotionally unavailable. The mind keeps searching because it cannot accept emotional uncertainty. And the deeper the attachment was, the stronger this mental obsession becomes. Because when the heart becomes emotionally attached, it creates expectations without realizing it. You thought the connection would continue. You thought the love was real and stable. You thought the future would unfold differently. Maybe you imagined growing old together. Maybe you imagined healing together. Maybe you imagined they would always stay. And when reality suddenly moved in the opposite direction, your mind experienced shock. Not only emotional pain, but psychological confusion. Buddhism teaches that attachment becomes painful when reality refuses to match the story the mind created. The suffering is not only coming from losing the person, the suffering is also coming from losing the future you imagined with them. And this is why the mind keeps going backward, because part of you still hopes the past can somehow change. Part of you still hopes there is one missing answer that will finally make the pain disappear. But the truth is, some endings will never fully make sense. Some people do not know how to explain themselves clearly. Some people leave while still pretending to care. Some people become strangers slowly, and some people simply change without warning. Life does not always give emotional closure in the clean way the mind wants. And this becomes very difficult for the ego to accept, because the ego wants complete understanding before letting go. It wants certainty before peace. But Buddhism teaches something very deep. Peace does not come from solving every emotional mystery. Peace comes from ending the inner resistance to reality. The moment you stop fighting what already happened, the mind slowly begins becoming quieter. Not immediately, not overnight, but little by little, the emotional noise starts losing strength. You stop needing answers for every detail. You stop replaying the same memories constantly. You stop trying to reopen closed emotional doors. And eventually, you realize something powerful. Closure was never something another person was supposed to give you. True closure happens the moment you finally accept. It happened. It hurt. It changed me. But I no longer need to chase understanding in order to heal. That is when the mind slowly releases its obsession. Because healing truly begins the moment you stop arguing with reality and start allowing life to move forward without carrying the past inside your head every single day. You were not attached to them. You were attached to who you became around them. Sometimes the deepest attachment is not actually about the person. It is about the version of yourself that existed when they were around. This is something many people never realize. You think you miss them, but what you truly miss is how alive you felt in their presence. Maybe before they entered your life, you felt emotionally empty. Maybe you felt unnoticed, lonely, disconnected from yourself. And then suddenly, they arrived. They gave you attention, affection, validation, comfort. They listened to you. They understood parts of you others ignored. They made you feel emotionally seen. And slowly, your inner world began changing around their presence. You smiled more. You felt lighter. You started imagining a future again. Life felt emotionally colorful. For the first time in a long time, you felt important to someone, and without realizing it, your mind connected your happiness to them. This is how emotional dependency quietly begins. Not all at once. Very slowly. At first it feels harmless. You simply enjoy their company. You think about them often. You wait for their messages. But then something deeper starts happening. Their attention begins controlling your emotional state. When they reply quickly, you feel calm. When they become distant, your chest feels heavy. When they give affection, you feel valuable. When they pull away, you suddenly feel insecure. Your peace starts rising and falling according to their behavior. And this is where attachment becomes dangerous. Because now, you are no longer emotionally connected. You are emotionally dependent. Buddhism teaches that suffering begins the moment your inner stability depends on something outside yourself. Because everything outside you is temporary. People change. Feelings change. Relationships change. Human beings are constantly changing every single moment. But the mind wants permanence from temporary things. The mind wants someone to stay forever, love forever, choose you forever. And because reality cannot promise this, fear quietly enters the relationship. Fear of losing them, fear of abandonment, fear of replacement, fear that one day they may stop loving you the same way. This is why attachment creates anxiety. Because deep down, the mind knows nothing external can remain permanent forever. And the more emotionally attached you become, the more terrified the mind becomes of losing what it depends on. This is why some people cannot stop thinking about someone even years later. Because they did not only lose the person, they lost the emotional identity they built around them. Maybe you felt beautiful around them, confident around them, safe around them, worthy around them. And after they left, it suddenly felt like those parts of you disappeared too. So now, your mind keeps chasing them, thinking they were the source of your happiness. But Buddhism teaches something powerful. No person was ever meant to become the foundation of your inner peace. Because when another human being becomes the center of your emotional world, you slowly abandon yourself without noticing. You stop listening to your own needs. You stop protecting your own peace. You stop building your own emotional stability. Everything becomes about keeping the connection alive, even if it hurts you, even if it exhausts you, even if deep down you know the relationship is no longer healthy. This is why many people stay emotionally attached to relationships that constantly drain them, because they are not only afraid of losing the person, they are afraid of losing the version of themselves they became around that person. And that fear becomes incredibly powerful. The mind starts believing, I will never feel that way again. I will never be loved like that again. I will never find that emotional connection again. But these thoughts are created by attachment, not truth. No human being owns your ability to feel alive. No person owns your worth. No relationship creates your value. The peace you experienced around them was not proof they completed you. It was proof certain emotions inside you were awakened temporarily. But those emotions still exist within you. The love, the warmth, the joy, the emotional openness. Those things were never truly owned by another person. They were experiences moving through your own consciousness. And healing begins when you stop trying to recover yourself through someone else's return. Because the truth is, you do not need them back in order to reconnect with yourself again. You do not need their attention to feel worthy again. You do not need their validation to feel complete again. Real freedom begins the moment your identity no longer depends on being emotionally chosen by another human being. Because true inner peace is not built on attachment. It is built on awareness. Awareness that your value exists even when someone leaves. Awareness that your peace can survive loss. Awareness that you are still whole, even after someone walks away. And once you truly understand this, the attachment slowly begins losing its control over your mind. The mind replays emotional pain until it quietly becomes an addiction. One of the most dangerous things about emotional pain is that the mind can slowly become addicted to it without realizing it. At first, you are simply hurt. You miss them. You feel confused. You replay memories because your heart is trying to process what happened. This is normal, but after some time, something deeper begins happening. The pain stops being temporary and starts becoming part of your daily mental routine. You wake up and think about them automatically. You check your phone hoping to see their name. You replay old conversations while doing simple tasks. You imagine fake scenarios in your head. You create emotional conversations that are no longer even real. And slowly, your mind starts living more in memory than in the present moment. This is how suffering quietly becomes psychological habit. Buddhism teaches that the mind becomes attached to whatever it repeats constantly. Even suffering, even sadness, even emotional longing, because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity starts feeling emotionally safe to the mind. This is why some people continue reopening wounds that are already trying to heal. They revisit old photos, old voice notes, old messages, old places, old memories. Not because it truly helps them heal, but because the emotional pain has become familiar, and the human mind often chooses familiar pain over unfamiliar peace. That is a very deep truth. Sometimes healing feels uncomfortable because suffering became part of your identity. You became used to being the person who misses them, the person who waits, the person who hurts, the person who cannot move on. And after a while, the pain almost starts feeling meaningful because it keeps the emotional connection alive. The mind secretly believes, if I stop thinking about them, maybe the connection will fully disappear. So the mind keeps replaying the pain to avoid accepting the ending completely. This is why people sometimes hold on to suffering for years, not because the love is still alive in the same way, but because the mind became emotionally dependent on the cycle itself. Pain became routine. Longing became routine. Sadness became emotionally familiar. and the brain keeps returning to familiar emotional patterns automatically. This is why certain memories suddenly appear at night, why one small reminder can emotionally destroy your mood for hours, why your mind keeps searching for them even when part of you already knows the relationship is over. Because emotional attachment is not only spiritual, it is also mental conditioning. The mind practices suffering repeatedly until suffering becomes automatic, and eventually, you stop realizing how much energy the attachment is stealing from your life. Your body becomes exhausted. Your nervous system stays tense. Your peace slowly disappears. You may laugh with people during the day, but deep inside, part of your mind is still emotionally trapped in the past, still replaying, still hoping, still imagining, still hurting. And this becomes dangerous because the mind starts confusing emotional intensity with love. But Buddhism teaches something important. Constant emotional suffering is not proof of deep love. Sometimes it is proof of deep attachment. Real love brings clarity, presence, peace, growth. Attachment brings obsession, fear, mental exhaustion, emotional chaos. There is a difference. And many people spend years suffering because they mistake obsession for connection. The mind says, if I still hurt this much, it must mean they were meant for me. But pain alone does not prove meaning. Sometimes pain only proves attachment was strong, and attachment can become incredibly addictive because it constantly stimulates the mind emotionally. Even toxic emotional cycles can feel hard to leave because the brain becomes used to the emotional highs and lows. One moment hope, one moment sadness, one moment fantasy, one moment grief, and the mind keeps spinning inside this emotional loop endlessly. But awareness changes everything. The moment you begin observing your mental habits carefully, you start seeing the pattern clearly. You notice how often your mind voluntarily returns to suffering. You notice how certain songs trigger emotional spirals, how loneliness triggers memories, how silence makes the mind search for emotional stimulation again. And for the first time, you begin separating yourself from the cycle. This is the beginning of freedom, because now you are no longer completely unconscious inside the attachment. Now you are watching it happen. Buddhism teaches that awareness weakens attachment. The moment you stop automatically obeying every emotional thought, the cycle slowly loses power. Not immediately. The mind will still replay memories sometimes. The sadness may still return in waves. Certain nights may still feel heavy. But slowly, you stop feeding the suffering constantly. You stop romanticizing pain. You stop worshipping memories. You stop reopening emotional doors every single day. And something beautiful begins happening. The mind becomes quieter. Your body relaxes again. Your attention returns to the present. Life slowly starts feeling real again instead of emotionally foggy. And eventually, you realize something very powerful. You were never trapped by the person alone. You were trapped by the mental habit of returning to them again and again inside your own mind. And once that habit breaks, the attachment slowly begins disappearing too. You are grieving a version of them that no longer exists. One of the deepest reasons you cannot stop thinking about someone is because the person your mind is attached to may no longer even exist. This is something painful to accept, but it is true. Most people are not suffering because of who the person is now. They are suffering because of a memory, a fantasy, a version of the person their mind created and emotionally preserved. The mind has a powerful habit after emotional loss. It edits reality. It keeps the beautiful moments alive while slowly hiding the painful truth. You begin remembering their smile more than their inconsistency, their affection more than the confusion they caused, their warmth more than the emotional exhaustion you felt trying to keep the relationship alive. And slowly, The mind turns memories into emotional illusions. This is why attachment feels so intense. Because you are no longer seeing the full reality clearly. You are remembering selected emotional highlights while ignoring the complete picture. Buddhism teaches that suffering grows when the mind becomes attached to illusion instead of truth. And this happens constantly in relationships. The mind creates fantasy very easily, especially after loss. Suddenly you start thinking, maybe they were perfect for me. Maybe I will never find someone like them again. Maybe I lost the best thing that ever happened to me. But often, the mind is not remembering reality honestly. It is remembering emotional fragments, pieces of moments, pieces of feelings, pieces of comfort. And because the relationship ended, your mind starts treating those memories as more valuable than they actually were. This is why people sometimes miss relationships that were deeply unhealthy. Because distance makes memory softer. Time removes some of the emotional pressure, and the mind starts romanticizing what once caused suffering. You forget how anxious you felt waiting for their replies. You forget how often you felt emotionally confused. You forget the nights your chest felt heavy because of their inconsistency. You forget how many times you abandoned your own peace just to keep the connection alive. Instead, the mind focuses on small, beautiful moments and turns them into emotional worship. One laugh, one hug, one memory, one moment of affection. And suddenly, the mind builds an entire emotional fantasy around moments that were never meant to carry your whole future. This is why attachment can feel impossible to escape. Because the mind is no longer attached to the real person, it is attached to an idealized emotional version of them. A version without flaws, without distance, without emotional confusion. But that version only exists inside memory now, not reality. Buddhism teaches that human beings suffer deeply when they resist seeing life clearly as it truly is. The mind wants permanence. It wants beautiful moments to last forever. But life keeps changing. People change. Feelings change. Connections change. And sometimes the person you love genuinely existed only for a season of your life. That does not make the connection fake. It simply makes it temporary. But the ego struggles with temporary things. It wants emotional ownership. It wants certainty. It wants to believe, this person is mine forever. And when reality removes that illusion, suffering begins. Because now the mind keeps trying to emotionally resurrect something that no longer exists in the same form. This is why you may still feel emotionally attached, even when deep down you know the relationship could never truly work anymore. Part of you already understands reality, but another part is still emotionally holding on to memory, still replaying old moments, still imagining different outcomes, still secretly wishing the past could return unchanged. But the past never returns the same way. And this becomes one of the hardest lessons in life. Sometimes you are not grieving the loss of the person. You are grieving the loss of the dream you created around them, the future you imagined, the emotional safety you hoped for, the life your mind secretly built in fantasy. And when that fantasy breaks, the mind feels shattered because it was emotionally living inside an imagined future that never arrived. This is why attachment hurts so deeply. Not only because someone left, but because the future you emotionally invested in disappeared too. Buddhism teaches that peace begins the moment you stop asking life to remain frozen. Everything changes. Every person, every feeling, every season of life. And suffering becomes unbearable when the mind keeps demanding permanence from temporary experiences. Healing begins when you finally stop worshipping memory. When you stop turning old emotions into sacred emotional prisons, when you stop confusing emotional intensity with destiny, because not every powerful connection was meant to last forever. Some people arrive only to teach you something. Some arrive to awaken parts of you. Some arrive to expose your wounds. Some arrive to show you how deeply attached the mind can become. And once the lesson is complete, life moves forward, but the mind keeps trying to hold the moment still. That is where suffering begins. True healing starts when you finally see the relationship clearly. Not only the beautiful moments, but the full truth. the confusion, the imbalance, the emotional exhaustion, the fear, the instability, the ways you slowly lost yourself trying to hold on to something already fading. Because clarity breaks illusion, and illusion is what keeps attachment alive. The moment you stop idealizing the past, the emotional fog slowly begins disappearing, and for the first time, you stop chasing the version of them that only exists inside your head. You stop begging memory to become reality again. You stop emotionally living in a world that no longer exists. And slowly, your heart begins returning to the present moment again. Not perfectly, not instantly, but peacefully, one breath at a time. Loneliness makes old attachments feel like love again. Loneliness changes the way the mind sees people, especially emotional loneliness. There are moments in life when everything becomes quiet. The conversations become fewer, the nights become longer, the distractions stop working, and suddenly, all the emotions you were avoiding begin rising to the surface again. This is usually when the mind starts returning to old attachments. Not always because you truly want the person back, but because loneliness makes familiar emotions feel comforting again. This is why someone can spend weeks feeling strong, then suddenly miss a person deeply during one lonely night. The mind begins remembering them more intensely. Their smile, their voice, their attention, their presence, and slowly, the loneliness starts turning old emotional memories into something that feels like love again. But Buddhism teaches something very important. Loneliness can distort emotional perception. When the heart feels empty, the mind starts searching desperately for anything familiar to fill the silence. And often, it chooses old attachments, even painful ones, even toxic ones, even relationships that once destroyed your peace. Because the mind confuses familiarity with safety. This is why people sometimes return emotionally to relationships that hurt them deeply, not because the relationship was healthy, but because the loneliness feels heavier than the pain. That is a powerful truth many people never admit to themselves. Sometimes people are not missing the person, they are missing distraction from their emptiness. When you feel emotionally alone, the mind becomes vulnerable. It starts romanticizing the past. Suddenly, the relationship only looks beautiful in memory. The mind forgets the anxiety, the confusion, the emotional exhaustion, the nights you cried trying to understand someone who kept hurting you. Instead, loneliness edits the memory. It softens reality, and slowly, the attachment begins feeling meaningful again. This is why nights are often the hardest, because silence removes distraction. During the day, people stay busy. Work, conversation, social media, noise, movement. But at night, there is nothing left between you and your own mind. And this is when unresolved attachment becomes loud again. The memories return, the fantasies return, the emotional longing returns. Not because the connection suddenly became right, but because silence exposed the emptiness inside. Buddhism teaches that most human beings are deeply uncomfortable being alone with themselves. Not physically alone, emotionally alone, because emotional stillness reveals everything we avoid during busy life. The loneliness, the insecurity, the fear of abandonment, the feeling of not being enough, the parts of ourselves we never fully healed. And instead of sitting with these emotions consciously, the mind escapes into attachment. It starts searching for someone to emotionally complete the emptiness, someone to remove the discomfort, someone to make life feel emotionally alive again. But this creates suffering, because no human being can permanently remove inner emptiness for you. Temporary comfort is not the same as inner peace. And this is where many people become trapped. They think, if I had them back, I would finally feel okay again. But often, even when they had the person, they were still anxious, still overthinking, still emotionally dependent, still afraid of losing them, because attachment never truly creates peace. It only creates temporary emotional stimulation. Real peace comes from learning how to remain emotionally grounded even in solitude. This is one of the deepest teachings in Buddhism. If you cannot sit peacefully with yourself, the mind will continuously search for external attachment to escape inner discomfort. And this is why many people move from one emotional attachment to another their entire lives. Not because they found true love, but because they never learned how to feel emotionally complete within themselves first. Loneliness becomes terrifying when your relationship with yourself is weak. When silence feels empty, the mind immediately starts craving distraction through people. But healing begins when solitude slowly becomes safe again. When you stop seeing loneliness as punishment. When you stop believing your worth depends on constant emotional attention. When you learn how to sit quietly with your own thoughts without immediately escaping into memory. At first, this feels uncomfortable, very uncomfortable, because for a long time, your mind used attachment to avoid facing itself. But slowly, something beautiful starts happening. You begin reconnecting with yourself again. You begin hearing your own thoughts clearly, feeling your own energy clearly, understanding your own wounds clearly. And for the first time, you stop needing another person to constantly fill the silence inside you. This changes everything, because now your peace is no longer built on emotional dependency. Now you can enjoy connection without becoming consumed by attachment. Now you can love without abandoning yourself. Now you can miss someone without mentally collapsing. Buddhism teaches that freedom begins the moment your happiness no longer depends on escaping loneliness. Because loneliness itself is not the real suffering. The real suffering comes from believing you are incomplete when you are alone. And once you stop believing that lie, the old attachments slowly begin losing their emotional power over you. You stop romanticizing people who only existed to temporarily distract you from yourself. You stop begging the past to rescue you emotionally. You stop needing someone else's presence to feel alive. And slowly, your own inner presence becomes enough. Not empty, not lonely, but peaceful, deeply peaceful. Your ego cannot accept that someone stopped choosing you. One of the hardest emotional wounds for the human mind to accept is rejection. Not only because it hurts the heart, but because it hurts the ego. The ego wants to feel important, special, desired, irreplaceable. It wants to believe, if someone truly loved me, they would never leave. So when someone slowly becomes distant, changes their behavior, or stops choosing you the same way, the ego experiences deep emotional shock. Suddenly, your mind starts questioning everything about yourself. What did I do wrong? Why was I not enough? What do they see in someone else that they did not see in me? How could they forget me so easily? And slowly, your pain stops being only about the relationship. It becomes personal identity. Now the mind is no longer simply grieving the loss. The mind is trying to repair wounded self-worth. This is why some heartbreaks become obsessions. Because the ego cannot tolerate feeling replaceable. It cannot tolerate the idea that someone once looked at you with love and then slowly stopped. The ego takes this deeply personally, even if the relationship itself was unhealthy, even if the connection was full of confusion, even if deep down you know the relationship could never truly give you peace. The ego still wants one thing, to be chosen again. This is why many people secretly do not want closure. They want validation. They want the person to come back and say, "You mattered. I still think about you. Me. I made a mistake. You were special." Because the ego believes those words would finally remove the pain. But Buddhism teaches something very important. When your worth depends on another person choosing you, your peace becomes fragile. Because human beings are unstable. People change constantly. Their emotions change. Their desires change. Their priorities change. And if your self-worth depends on their attention, your emotional world will constantly rise and fall according to their behavior. This creates enormous suffering because now your peace is no longer yours. It belongs to whoever gives you validation. This is why attachment creates emotional chaos. One message can make you feel valuable. One silence can make you feel worthless. One small sign of rejection can emotionally destroy your entire day. And slowly, you begin living emotionally controlled by external approval. Buddhism teaches that the ego is always searching outside itself for identity. It wants praise, attention, recognition, validation, but external validation can never create stable inner peace. Because the moment attention disappears, the ego collapses again. This is why some people cannot move on even after years. Not because love remained the same, but because the ego never fully healed from the rejection. Part of them is still trying to emotionally prove something, still trying to show they were worthy, still trying to be remembered, still secretly hoping the other person regrets losing them. And this creates endless mental suffering, because now the mind is trapped inside emotional comparison. You start comparing yourself to new people in their life. You start wondering if they treat someone else better. You start imagining them happier without you. And the ego turns all of this into proof that you somehow failed. But the truth is, another person leaving does not define your value. Human beings leave for countless reasons. Sometimes because they are emotionally immature. Sometimes because they are confused. Sometimes because they are chasing temporary desires. Sometimes because they are unable to love deeply. Sometimes because life simply moves people in different directions. But the ego always personalizes loss. It says, if they left, something must be wrong with me. And this belief creates deep emotional suffering. Because now you are not only grieving a person, you are fighting your own self-image. This is why rejection feels so painful physically. Your chest becomes heavy, your stomach tightens, your nervous system becomes overwhelmed. Because the ego experiences rejection almost like survival danger. It feels like losing emotional identity itself. But Buddhism teaches that your true self is deeper than the ego. Your worth is not created by being chosen, and it does not disappear because someone walked away. You were valuable before they entered your life, and you remain valuable after they leave. But attachment blinds the mind to this truth. The ego becomes so focused on being wanted by one specific person that it forgets its own inner wholeness. This is why healing requires more than simply forgetting someone. Healing requires rebuilding your relationship with yourself. It requires learning how to feel complete without needing constant emotional confirmation. At first, this feels difficult because the ego constantly craves reassurance. It wants signs, attention, message, proof that it still matters. But every time you chase validation from the outside world, you strengthen emotional dependency again. True freedom begins when your self-worth no longer depends on another person's approval, when silence no longer makes you feel worthless, when rejection no longer destroys your identity, when someone leaving no longer makes you question your value as a human being. This is one of the deepest forms of inner peace, because now you stop begging people to choose you. You stop chasing emotional validation. You stop trying to force yourself into places where your presence is no longer fully valued. And instead, you begin choosing yourself consciously. Your peace, your dignity, your emotional health. You begin understanding something powerful. The right people will never require you to lose yourself just to keep their attention. Real connection does not constantly make you feel emotionally insecure. Real love does not leave you starving for reassurance every day. And once you truly understand this, the ego slowly begins relaxing. The obsession weakens. The mental chasing slows down. The emotional desperation fades. Because now you no longer need someone else to confirm your worth in order to feel whole. Now your peace comes from within, not from being chosen, but from finally realizing you were always enough even when someone failed to see it. The person living inside your mind is no longer real. One of the deepest truths Buddhism tries to teach is that the mind creates its own version of reality. And sometimes, the person you are suffering over no longer truly exists outside your thoughts. What lives inside your head now is not fully the real person anymore. It is a mental version created by memory, emotion, attachment, fantasy, fear, and repetition. The mind has replayed them so many times that it slowly created an internal emotional character that feels more powerful than reality itself. This is why you can still feel emotionally overwhelmed by someone even when they are physically absent from your life. Because the attachment is no longer happening outside you. It is happening inside your own mind. You are no longer only remembering the person. You are interacting with a psychological version of them, your thoughts recreated again and again. This is why memories feel so emotionally real. One thought can suddenly change your entire mood. One memory can tighten your chest. One imagined conversation can emotionally drain you for hours. And the strange part is, nothing may actually be happening in the present moment. The person may not even be thinking about you. Yet your body still reacts emotionally as if the relationship is actively happening right now. This is the power of the mind. Buddhism teaches that human beings often suffer more from their thoughts about reality than from reality itself. The mind creates emotional worlds, and once attachment becomes strong, those emotional worlds begin controlling your inner peace. This is why overthinking feels endless. Because the mind keeps feeding itself emotionally, one memory creates another memory. One thought creates another thought. One fantasy creates another fantasy. And slowly, you become trapped inside an invisible emotional loop. You replay things that already ended. You imagine conversations that never happen. You create emotional scenarios in your head repeatedly. And because the mind keeps emotionally stimulating itself, the attachment survives. This is why some people stay emotionally trapped for years after someone leaves. Not because the relationship still exists physically, but because the mind continues recreating it psychologically every single day. You may think, but my feelings are real, and they are real. The emotions are real. The sadness is real. The longing is real. The attachment feels real. But the mental version of the person your mind keeps interacting with is no longer reality itself. It is memory mixed with imagination, and memory is never fully accurate. The mind edits memory constantly. It removes details, adds emotions, changes perspectives, romanticizes moments. This is why the person inside your mind slowly becomes different from the actual human being. Your mind freezes them emotionally in certain moments. The smile they gave you once, the affection they showed once, the way they looked at you once, and then your mind keeps replaying those moments so often that it starts treating them like permanent truth. But human beings are not frozen moments. People are constantly changing. The person you miss may already think differently now, feel differently now, live differently now, but the mind keeps holding on to old emotional snapshots, as if nothing ever changed. And this creates suffering, because now you are emotionally attached not only to a person, but to a mental illusion built from selective memory. Buddhism teaches that attachment survives through unconscious identification with thought. You suffer because you believe every thought deserves emotional attention. Every memory feels important. Every feeling feels meaningful. Every emotional wave feels like truth. But awareness changes this completely. The moment you stop automatically believing every thought, something inside you begins waking up. You begin noticing how the mind creates suffering repeatedly. You notice how certain thoughts immediately pull your emotions downward. You notice how imagination creates anxiety, how fantasy creates longing, how memory recreates pain. And slowly, you begin separating awareness from thought. This is one of the most powerful spiritual shifts a human being can experience. Because now, you are no longer completely lost inside the mind. Now, you are watching the mind. You are observing the thoughts instead of drowning inside them. And for the first time, a small space begins appearing between you and your emotional reactions. That space is freedom before awareness. Every thought controlled you automatically. A memory appeared, and your mood collapsed. A reminder appeared, and your mind spiraled for hours. But now, something changes. Now, when thoughts arise, you start recognizing them for what they truly are. Mental activity, temporary movement inside consciousness. Not absolute truth, not commands, not reality itself. Just thoughts passing through the mind. Buddhism teaches that thoughts are like clouds moving across the sky. The problem is not that thoughts appear. The problem is that people become attached to them. They follow every thought. believe every feeling, enter every emotional doorway the mind opens, and eventually they become prisoners of their own thinking. But healing begins the moment you stop emotionally chasing every thought your mind produces. You stop feeding every memory. You stop worshipping every feeling. You stop treating mental repetition like destiny. And slowly, the illusion begins weakening. The person inside your head starts losing emotional power over you. Not because you force yourself to forget them, but because you finally stop rebuilding them mentally every single day. This changes everything, because now the mind slowly becomes quieter. The emotional intensity fades. The obsession weakens. The mental replaying becomes less constant. And eventually, you realize something that completely transforms your understanding of suffering. Most of your pain was not coming from the person anymore. It was coming from the mind continuously recreating them inside your inner world. And once the mind stops rebuilding the attachment, peace slowly returns. Not all at once, but gently, silently, like the sky becoming clear again after a long storm finally passes. True freedom begins the moment you stop feeding the attachment. Most people believe healing happens automatically with time, but Buddhism teaches something much deeper. Time alone does not heal attachment, because while time passes, the mind may still be secretly feeding the attachment every single day. You may stop talking to them, but still think about them constantly. You may remove them from your life physically, but still keep rebuilding them emotionally inside your mind. And this is why some people stay trapped for years. Not because the relationship still exists, but because the attachment is still being emotionally fed. Every memory you replay, every fantasy you create, every old message you reread, every time you check their profile, every time you secretly hope they come back, you are giving emotional energy to the attachment again. And whatever receives repeated attention becomes stronger inside the mind. This is one of the deepest Buddhist truths. Attention is energy. Where your attention goes, your emotional life follows. If your attention constantly returns to pain, pain becomes stronger. If your attention constantly returns to attachment, attachment survives. Most people say, "I want peace," but their mind spends the entire day feeding emotional suffering unconsciously. They replay old memories, imagine impossible futures, romanticize the past, secretly wait for closure, secretly hope for reunion, and then wonder why the wound never fully heals. But healing begins the moment you stop emotionally feeding what is hurting you. This does not mean forcing yourself to hate the person. It does not mean pretending the memories never mattered. And it does not mean becoming cold or emotionless. Buddhism is not about suppressing emotion. It is about becoming aware of how attachment controls the mind. There is a difference. You can still remember someone without mentally living inside them. You can still care about someone without losing yourself emotionally. You can still feel sadness sometimes without allowing the sadness to consume your inner peace completely. This is where true freedom begins. Not when memories disappear, but when memories no longer control you. At first, this feels difficult, very difficult, because attachment becomes part of your emotional routine. The mind is used to thinking about them constantly, used to checking, used to hoping, used to imagining. And when you stop feeding the attachment, the mind feels withdrawal. Silence suddenly feels uncomfortable. The emotional stimulation disappears. And for a while, you may feel empty. This is why many people return to old attachments. Not because they truly belong there, but because they cannot tolerate the temporary emptiness that healing creates. Buddhism teaches that the mind constantly seeks stimulation to avoid stillness, even painful stimulation. This is why some people repeatedly reopen wounds that are already trying to close, because pain feels more emotionally active than peace. Chaos feels more familiar than calm. Longing feels more alive than stillness. But eventually, if you stop feeding the attachment long enough, something beautiful begins happening inside you. The mind slowly becomes quieter, not because you forced it, but because you stopped supplying it with endless emotional fuel. You stop replaying the same emotional movie every night. You stop turning memories into worship. You stop treating suffering like proof of love. And slowly, your nervous system relaxes again. Your body feels lighter. Your breathing softens. Your thoughts stop racing constantly. Life slowly returns to the present moment. This is one of the most peaceful feelings a human being can experience. Because for so long, your mind was emotionally trapped in yesterday, trapped in memory, trapped in fantasy, trapped in emotional repetition. But now, your awareness begins returning to what is actually real. This breath, this moment, this life in front of you. And the more present you become, the weaker the attachment grows. Because attachment survives through unconscious mental repetition. Without constant feeding, it slowly fades naturally. This is why Buddhism places so much importance on awareness. Awareness interrupts unconscious suffering. Before awareness, the mind controlled you completely. A memory appeared, and you followed it. A feeling appeared, and you drowned inside it. A lonely night arrived, and your mind ran back to the past automatically. But now, something changes. Now you pause. Now you observe. Now you notice the thought without becoming trapped inside it. And that small moment of awareness changes everything. Because now, you are no longer fully identified with the attachment. You begin understanding, this is only a thought. This is only memory. This is only emotional habit. This is not my entire reality. And once awareness enters deeply, the attachment slowly starts losing power over your inner world. Not instantly. Healing is not instant. Some days the memories will still hurt. Some nights will still feel heavy. Some emotions will still return unexpectedly. But now, you no longer build your entire identity around them. You no longer allow one person to occupy your entire inner life. You stop making your suffering sacred. And eventually, something shifts quietly inside you. You think about them less. Not because you forced yourself to forget, but because your mind finally stopped needing them for emotional survival. This is true healing. When the attachment no longer controls your peace, when memories can exist without destroying you, when someone's absence no longer makes life feel empty, when your happiness is no longer chained to who stays and who leaves. Buddhism teaches that real peace comes from non-attachment, not coldness, not avoidance, but freedom. Freedom from needing temporary things to complete you emotionally. Freedom from mentally chasing what already ended. Freedom from becoming a prisoner of memory. And one day, you will notice something that once felt impossible. Their name will enter your mind, and your heart will remain calm. No panic, no obsession, no emotional collapse. Only quiet awareness. Only acceptance. Only peace. And in that moment, you finally understand what true freedom actually feels like. Not needing to erase the past, but no longer being controlled by it. And maybe this is the moment you finally stop asking yourself, why can't I let them go? Because now you understand. It was never only about the person. It was about attachment, memory, loneliness, ego, emotional habit, the mind's fear of emptiness. For so long, you thought healing meant forcing yourself not to care. But Buddhism teaches something softer than that. Healing is not the violent removal of emotion. Healing is the quiet moment you stop letting emotion control your entire inner world. The quiet moment you stop chasing what already ended. The quiet moment you stop abandoning yourself just to keep someone alive inside your mind. And maybe that is why this pain entered your life in the first place. Not to destroy you, but to awaken you. To show you how deeply the mind clings, how easily the heart becomes attached, how much suffering comes from trying to hold on to things life was already asking you to release. Because the truth is, some people were never meant to stay forever. Some people enter your life only to reveal the places inside you that still needed healing. And painful as it feels, that lesson can completely transform your life if you truly understand it. One day, you will wake up and notice something has changed. The memories will still exist, but they will no longer control you. Their name will cross your mind, but your chest will stay calm. You will hear the song, see the place, remember the moments, and instead of collapsing emotionally, you will simply breathe. peacefully, because your happiness will no longer be trapped inside another person's presence. It will finally belong to you again. And that is the moment true healing begins. The moment your mind stops living in the past and your soul finally returns to the present. So tonight, stop chasing closure from people who already became part of yesterday. Stop reopening wounds your heart is trying to heal from. Stop feeding thoughts that steal your peace. And slowly, gently, come back to yourself again. Because your peace is sacred. Your mind deserves rest. And your life was never meant to be spent carrying someone inside your head forever.